There is a phrase that appears more than any other command in the entire Bible: not love one another, not keep the commandments, not pray without ceasing. The single most repeated command in Scripture is this: do not be afraid. It appears in some form over 300 times across both testaments. And when you start paying attention to the specific moments Jesus says it, something begins to emerge that most people who have read the Gospels dozens of times have never noticed. It is not random. It is not comfort for comfort's sake. Every single time Jesus says, "Do not be afraid," something is happening underneath the surface of the text that changes what the words mean entirely. This is not a video about positive thinking or managing anxiety. This is about a pattern hidden inside the gospel accounts that reveals something specific about who Jesus understood himself to be and what he believed fear was actually doing to the people around him. If you are listening to this while winding down, that is exactly what this is made for. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are right now and what time it is for you. I read every single one of them, and it never gets old. Now, let's look at the pattern. The first thing you have to understand is the context in which the phrase was born, because "do not be afraid" did not originate with Jesus. It is one of the oldest phrases in the Hebrew Bible, and every Jewish listener who heard Jesus say it would have recognized immediately what category of moment they were in. In the Old Testament, "do not be afraid" almost always appears in one specific situation. It appears when a human being is suddenly in the presence of something that is not human. When the angel of the Lord appears to Hagar in the wilderness, alone and terrified with her dying son, the messenger says, "Do not be afraid." When God speaks to Abraham in a vision, the first words are, "Do not be afraid." When the angel appears to Gideon, when Gabriel appears to Daniel, when the divine presence settles on the mountain before Moses, the first impulse of every human being in those moments is terror. And the first response from heaven is always the same: do not be afraid. This matters enormously, because by the time Jesus begins his ministry, every literate Jewish person in Galilee and Judea would have understood what those words signaled. They were not general encouragement. They were the specific language of divine encounter. They were what heaven said when earth could not handle what was standing in front of it. So when Jesus uses this phrase, he is not simply being pastoral. He is placing himself inside a very specific tradition. And the question the Gospels are quietly asking every time he says it is, what exactly is it about this moment that requires the language of divine encounter? Let's walk through the specific instances, because the pattern only becomes visible when you look at them together. The first major instance in the ministry of Jesus's is on the Sea of Galilee. The disciples are in a boat at night. A storm has come up. Matthew, Mark, and John all record the event with slightly different details, but the core is the same. The disciples are terrified, and then they see Jesus walking on the water toward them, and they become more terrified because they think he is a ghost. Here is what most readings miss. Their fear before Jesus arrived was a fear of the storm. Reasonable, understandable, human fear of natural danger. But when Jesus appears, their fear does not decrease. It increases, and it changes in nature. They are no longer afraid of the storm. They are afraid of him. Jesus says immediately, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Matthew 14:27. That phrase, "it is I," in the Greek is ego eimi, I am. It is the same construction that appears in the Greek translation of Exodus, when God speaks to Moses from the burning bush and identifies himself. I am who I am. Ego eimi ho an. Jesus is walking on water, which in the Old Testament is a specific divine activity. Job 9:8 describes God alone as the one who trampled the waves of the sea. And he is identifying himself with the words that God used to identify himself to Moses. The disciples are not overreacting when they are afraid. They are having the correct response to something that their categories cannot contain. And do not be afraid is not a dismissal of their fear. It is an invitation to expand their categories. The second major instance happens on a mountain, the Transfiguration. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up a high mountain and his appearance changes. His face shines like the sun. His clothes become white as light. Moses and Elijah appear and speak with him. And then a cloud overshadows them, and a voice speaks from the cloud. This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. Matthew 17:5. And the disciples fall on their faces, overcome with fear. Matthew 17:6. This is not the fear of a storm. This is not confusion about what they are seeing. This is prostration. The same involuntary physical response that appears in the Old Testament every time a human being gets too close to the glory of God. Isaiah falls down undone in the temple. Ezekiel falls on his face before the vision of the divine throne. Daniel collapses like a dead man when Gabriel appears to him. The disciples fall down. And Jesus comes and touches them. That detail is in the text. He does not speak from a distance. He comes close and he touches them and he says, "Rise and have no fear." Matthew 17:7. The touch matters. Every time the language of divine encounter appears in the Old Testament, the human being is on the ground and the divine presence is at a distance. Here, the divine presence closes the distance. He touches them, and then he says, "Do not be afraid." When they look up, they see no one but Jesus only. The cloud is gone, Moses and Elijah are gone, the voice is silent, and there is Jesus, looking like himself again, telling them to get up. That sequence is the Transfiguration in miniature. Glory revealed, terror produced, touch given, fear addressed, ordinary face restored. But nothing is ordinary anymore because they have seen what is underneath the ordinary face. The third instance is less dramatic in setting, but more personal in content. It is in John 6, after the feeding of the 5,000. The disciples are again on the lake at night. Jesus is again walking on the water, and he says again, "It is I. Do not be afraid." John 6:20. But John adds a detail that Matthew and Mark do not emphasize. Immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. John 6:21. The journey ends the moment he gets in. This is not incidental. John is a precise writer who chooses every detail with intention. The destination that seemed far away and dangerous becomes immediately present when Jesus enters the situation. Do not be afraid is not just a command about internal emotional state. It is a statement about what changes when he is present. The thing you were afraid of not reaching, you have already reached. There is a pattern building here, and it is this. Every time Jesus says, "Do not be afraid" in a context of divine encounter, he is doing two things simultaneously. He is identifying himself with the God of the Old Testament, who appeared to prophets and patriarchs in terrifying glory. And he is doing something that God in the Old Testament very rarely did. He is closing the distance. The God of Sinai told Moses he could not see his face and live. The presence in the Holy of Holies was separated from the people by a thick curtain. The divine glory that filled the temple drove the priests out so that no one could stand to minister. Distance was the safety mechanism. You do not approach what you cannot survive. But Jesus walks toward the boat. Jesus comes down the mountain and touches the prostrate disciples. Jesus gets into the boat and the shore appears. Every time the divine encounter triggers the expected fear response, Jesus moves toward it rather than maintaining distance. And the do not be afraid is inseparable from that movement. It is not just a command, it is a description of what is now possible because of who is present and what he is doing with the distance. Now, let's look at a different category of instances, because not every time Jesus says do not be afraid is it in the context of miraculous display. Some of the most significant uses of the phrase are in quiet conversation, and they reveal a different dimension of the pattern. In Luke 12, Jesus is speaking to his disciples about anxiety, about what they will eat and what they will wear, about the sparrows and the lilies and the hairs on their heads. And near the end of that passage, he says, "Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." Luke 12:32. That phrase, little flock, is shepherd language, and it is tender in a way that is easy to read past. The disciples are being addressed as vulnerable creatures, small, dependent, easily frightened, naturally prone to scattering. Jesus is not pretending that is not what they are. He is not telling them to be stronger or braver or more self-sufficient. He is telling them that their smallness is known, that their vulnerability is seen, and that the one who sees it has already decided to give them everything. Fear not, little flock. Not fear not, mighty army. Not fear not, impressive institution. The address itself is the comfort. You are small. I see that you are small, and the kingdom is yours anyway. This is a completely different context from the boat on the lake or the mountain of transfiguration. There is no storm here, no blinding light, no prostration. There is just a group of ordinary people worried about ordinary things. And Jesus uses the same phrase, do not be afraid, which means the phrase is doing double duty in the Gospels. It is the language of divine encounter for moments when heaven breaks into the visible world in unmistakable ways. And it is also the language of pastoral presence for moments when ordinary human anxiety threatens to overwhelm ordinary human beings. And Jesus uses both registers without distinguishing between them, as if to say that the God who appears in terrifying glory on mountaintops is the same God who notices that you are worried about lunch. There is one more instance that contains the most concentrated version of the pattern. It is in the final hours before the crucifixion, in the upper room discourse recorded in John 14 through 16. Jesus is about to leave. The disciples know something is ending, though they do not fully understand what. And the atmosphere in those chapters is thick with a particular kind of fear. Not the fear of a storm or the fear of blinding light. The fear of abandonment. Jesus addresses it directly. Let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. John 14:1. And later, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. John 14:27. The word troubled there in the Greek is tarasso. It means to stir up, to agitate, to throw into confusion. It is the same word used in John 5 when the waters of the pool of Bethesda are stirred up. It is the same word used in John 11 when Jesus is described as troubled in spirit at the tomb of Lazarus. Jesus knows what tarasso feels like from the inside. He uses the word about his own interior state, and now he tells his disciples not to let it happen to them. Not as the world gives do I give to you. That line is the key to understanding what Jesus means by peace and by the absence of fear throughout his ministry. The world's version of peace is the absence of threatening circumstances. No storm, no danger, no uncertainty, no loss. Jesus is offering something different. Peace that exists inside threatening circumstances. Presence that remains when circumstances are at their worst. A do not be afraid that does not require the danger to be removed first. The disciples are about to watch him be arrested, tried, and executed. The danger is not being removed. The circumstances are about to get catastrophically worse. And he is still saying, do not be afraid. Which means the do not be afraid was never primarily about the circumstances. It was always about something else. About who is present, about what that presence changes, about what becomes possible when the one who walks on water and shines like the sun is also the one who closes the distance, touches the prostrate, gets in the boat, and calls his people little flock. After the resurrection, the pattern completes itself. Mary Magdalene is at the tomb. The stone is rolled away. She has run to tell the disciples, and they have left. She is alone, weeping, looking into an empty tomb. And then she turns, and there is Jesus. And she does not recognize him. She thinks he is the gardener. He says one word to her, her name, Mary, and she knows immediately. And she falls at his feet, and the angels in the tomb earlier in the account had already said what Jesus would not need to say again in that moment. Do not be afraid. Matthew 28:5. The angels say it to the women at the tomb. Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has risen. And then, a few verses later, Jesus himself meets them and says, do not be afraid. Matthew 28:10, the same phrase. On the other side of death, after everything that happened, after the arrest and the trial and the cross and the tomb and the stone, do not be afraid. If the phrase had only ever been about managing anxiety in difficult moments, it would have been unnecessary after the resurrection. The worst had happened. It was over. But Jesus says it again, which suggests the phrase was never simply reactive to bad circumstances. It is a posture. It is an ongoing orientation toward existence that Jesus was trying to install in his followers across every context, every category of difficulty, every kind of fear. Do not be afraid of the storm. Do not be afraid of the glory. Do not be afraid of abandonment. Do not be afraid of what happened. Do not be afraid of what is coming. Do not be afraid. So what is the pattern that most people miss? It is this. Every time Jesus says, do not be afraid, he is doing one of two things, or both simultaneously. He is identifying himself as the one before whom fear is the correct response, the divine presence that caused patriarchs and prophets to fall on their faces. And he is moving toward the people who are afraid rather than away from them. He is closing the distance that should, by every prior theological expectation, be unclosable. The command, do not be afraid, is not an instruction to deny the reality of what is frightening. It is not a command to feel differently by willpower. It is an announcement about who is present and what that presence has changed about the situation. You do not need to be afraid, because I am here. And because I am here, the thing that fear was telling you is true, that you are alone, that you are in danger, that you will not make it, that the shore is too far away, that the glory is too much, that the loss is too complete, that one is no longer true. The disciples were right to be afraid of the storm. Storms kill people. They were right to be afraid of the glory on the mountain. God's presence is genuinely overwhelming to human beings. They were right to be afraid of what was coming in Jerusalem. It was going to be terrible. Jesus did not deny any of that. He did not tell them the storm was not real, or the glory was not blinding, or the death was not coming. He said, "I am here." And where I am, fear does not get the last word. There is a practical dimension to this that is easy to miss when the discussion stays purely theological. The disciples who heard "do not be afraid" in all these contexts went on to live extraordinary lives in extraordinarily dangerous circumstances. They preached in cities where they were arrested. They stood before governors and kings. They were beaten and imprisoned, and eventually most of them were killed for what they believed. And the historical record suggests that they did all of this without the kind of paralysis that fear produces. That is not a small thing. Fear is one of the most effective tools for preventing action. It constricts decision-making. It narrows vision. It makes the path forward seem blocked, even when it is not. And people who live under chronic fear, fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of what others think, fear of the future, tend to live much smaller lives than the actual circumstances require. The disciples had heard something. They had been in the boat. They had been on the mountain. They had been in the upper room. And what they had heard was not a technique for managing anxiety. It was an encounter with someone who closed the distance between divine glory and human terror and spoke to them by name in the middle of both. And that encounter changed what they were capable of. Not because they stopped being afraid in the moment, but because they had a reference point outside the moment that fear could not reach. There is a final observation worth making. The phrase "do not be afraid" appears in the Gospels consistently in threshold moments. Moments of transition between one reality and another. The disciples crossing the lake are moving between safety and danger. The disciples on the mountain are standing between the ordinary face of Jesus and the unveiled glory. The disciples in the upper room are on the edge of his departure and everything that comes after. Mary at the tomb is between death and resurrection, between grief and recognition. Jesus says, "Do not be afraid" at thresholds, not on the safe side of the threshold where everything is familiar and contained. Not once the threshold has been crossed, and the new reality has settled in. At the threshold itself, in the place of maximum uncertainty, where what was is ending, and what will be has not yet arrived. That is where most fear lives. Not in the middle of the storm or after the storm has passed, but in the moment of transition, when the old certainties are gone and the new ones have not yet proven themselves. And that is precisely where Jesus shows up, walking across the water toward the boat that is not yet at shore, coming down the mountain to touch the disciples who are on the ground, meeting the women at the moment between the empty tomb and the fully understood resurrection. "Do not be afraid" is threshold language. It is the word spoken at the exact moment between what was and what will be. And it is spoken by someone who, according to every instance we have examined, is not watching from a distance, but is actively, physically, deliberately moving toward the people who are afraid. The pattern most people miss is that "do not be afraid" is never passive. It is always accompanied by presence. It is always spoken by someone who has already decided to close the distance. And the decision was made before the fearful person asked for it, before they earned it, before they fully understood who was coming toward them across the water. If this study opens something up for you in the way you read the Gospels, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. It means more than you might think. Like the video and subscribe so you don't miss where we go next. There are more patterns hidden in plain sight in these texts, and we are going to keep finding them together.